80 years ago, the global confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States began, which went down in history textbooks as the Cold War. Its main element was the arms race, the goal of which was to create the most advanced weapons of mass destruction. And we're talking not only about nuclear warheads, but also about biological weapons capable of causing deadly epidemics with millions of victims. Each side invested enormous resources into such research, and the results were kept strictly secret. In the USSR, work on biological weapons began as early as the early 1920s, apparently believing that deadly viruses would make the cause of world revolution go much more smoothly. But truly serious work only began in 1946. The main location for testing Soviet bacteriological weapons was Vozrozhdeniye Island in the Aral Sea. For 40 years, disease pathogens were tested here. Weaponized smallpox, anthrax, plague, typhus, brucellosis, and other deadly diseases, because work in this area continued right up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. So today, let's talk about how biological weapons were developed in the USSR, what results were achieved, and which pathogens they worked with. You will learn about a top-secret facility on Vozrozhdeniye Island, the terrifying experiments that took place there, as well as the threats that occurred.
Он до сих пор несет миру.
I'm Semyon, welcome to Mikosho TV. Let's begin. Combat viruses of communism. The first laboratory for creating poisons and combat pathogens was established in the USSR back in 1921 by a special order from Vladimir Lenin. In the documents, it appeared under the harmless name Special Office, and its first head was Professor Kazakov, who was executed by the Chekists in 1938. However, according to rumors, the Bolsheviks tried to use biological weapons as early as the Civil War, spreading the pathogens of typhoid and typhus where their opponents were stationed. There are suspicions that White Army General Nikolai Ivanov died from such an operation. In 1925, the Geneva Convention banning chemical and biological weapons was adopted, and the USSR joined it as well. But just 2 months after signing, the Red Army established a military chemical department for the development of biological weapons. Many well-known Soviet chemists were invited to work there. Naturally, all of this was carried out in the strictest secrecy. In the USSR, it wasn't only the military that worked on biological weapons. For example, in 1926, Ginsberg's laboratory began operating, where they worked on increasing the destructive capabilities of anthrax. In Perkushkovo near Moscow, they developed protection against biological attacks. Institutions with a similar profile appeared in Leningrad, Srednevekovsk, Suzdal, and Stepnogorsk. Large research centers were planned to be organized on Lake Baikal, but then they changed their minds. However, in the early 1930s, an institute was opened on the island of the city of Milia, which officially worked on a vaccine for foot and mouth disease. But that was just a cover. In reality, they were developing biological weapons there. It is also worth mentioning the Myronovsky laboratory, where toxins and biological weapons were created. It was part of the state security system, first the NKVD and later the KGB. Significant funds and resources were invested in this area, so the results did not take long to appear. So, at the beginning of 1934, the head of the Military Chemical Directorate, Fishman, reported to People's Commissar Voroshilov that a weapon codenamed Substance 49 based on anthrax was ready for use. Lev Fyodorov, one of the most authoritative researchers on this issue, claims that the testing of bacteriological weapons in the USSR was large-scale. Aviation and the Navy were involved in them. The Red Army was actively preparing for biological warfare. The program was overseen by the People's Commissar of Defense, Kliment Voroshilov. According to Fyodorov, bacteriological weapons were widely tested on people, specifically prisoners in jails and camps. Attempts were made to use bacteriological weapons during the war. On the eve of the Soviet counteroffensive near Stalingrad, tularemia pathogens were used against the Germans. However, nothing good came out of it. The victims of the attack were not Wehrmacht soldiers, but rodents, which rushed en masse into the positions of the Soviet troops. As the future Marshal of Aviation, Sergei Rudenko, recalled, the 10 days preceding the counteroffensive seemed dramatic for the 16th Air Army. In the first half of November, we were warned about a mouse invasion. Moreover, the rodents turned out to be infected with tularemia. The army headquarters suffered the most. Breaking into houses, the mice contaminated food and water, and people started getting sick. After the war ended, work on biological weapons in the USSR not only continued but accelerated even more. No expense was spared for this. More than 50,000 specialists were involved in the secret program. There were 52 sites across the country where biological weapons were developed, produced, and tested. At the end of 1948, construction began on a secret biological weapons testing facility on Vozrozhdeniye Island in the Aral Sea. Until the very collapse of the evil empire, this island remained the main site for testing Soviet weaponized viruses and bacteria. The infected island first. A few words about Vozrozhdeniye Island itself. It is located in the southwestern part of the Aral Sea, and due to the sea's shallowing, it has long since turned into a peninsula. In 1960, its area was 215 square kilometers. It is believed that the island was formed at the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century, after another drop in the level of the Aral Sea. The island was discovered by Lieutenant Butakov's expedition in 1848. Initially, it was named after Tsar Nikolai I. They say it was a real paradise for hunting and fishing. By the way, Taras Shevchenko, who was living in exile in the far reaches of the empire for his revolutionary views, took part in that expedition. After the Bolsheviks came to power, the reactionary name was changed to a more fitting one, Rebirth Island. Considering its subsequent history, that name sounds more like a dark joke. There is information that in the 1920s, kulaks and other undesirable elements were exiled to the island. However, it's unclear how they survived with a complete lack of fresh water. In the summer of 1936, a group of military biologists led by Professor Velikanov, who is often referred to as a psychological program, landed here. Already the following year, work began on the island with the pathogens of tularemia, plague, and cholera. Of course, not everything went smoothly. In the late 1930s, a wave of repression struck the Red Army's military chemical administration leadership. That same Velikanov was executed by shooting in 1938. During the war, the research stopped altogether, but after it ended, they resumed on an even larger scale. It should be said that Vozrozhdeniye Island was almost perfect for testing biological weapons. The hot climate and abundance of ultraviolet light suppressed the activity of various pathogens, which, together with the island's remote location, reduced the likelihood of infections spreading. The testing site's isolation effectively protected it from foreign intelligence attention. However, in 1962, the Americans learned about the existence of a strange object in the middle of the Aral Sea using satellites, after which they began to regularly monitor activity there. Construction work on the island began at the end of 1948. Already the following year, a runway capable of accommodating military transport aircraft appeared, along with the first barracks for soldiers and houses for officers with their families. In the northern part of the island, a military town called Kantubek was built, officially named Aralsk 7. Overall, it resembled hundreds of other similar towns that appeared across the USSR. About 15 residential buildings for officers and scientists, a club, a cafeteria, a stadium, shops, barracks, and a parade ground, and its own power station. A few kilometers away was the laboratory building. Even from the remaining ruins, you can tell how serious the investments were in the Soviet military biological program. The testing ground consisted of 2 main complexes and 3 experimental fields. The laboratory was equipped with the most modern equipment and a completely sealed module on the 2nd floor. It was equipped in accordance with Biosafety Level 3 standards. A stud farm was built next to the testing ground specifically for the needs of the military. The horses were used for experiments, and their blood was taken to prepare serum and nutrient media for cultivating deadly strains. It's quite symbolic that in 44 years of its existence, the secret testing ground never got its own cemetery. There was a crematorium and a deep reinforced concrete sarcophagus. Secrecy and security measures. At its peak, up to 1,500 military personnel, scientists, and their families lived on the island. Children went to school, adults went to work. In the evenings, they watched movies at the officers' club, and on weekends they had picnics on the shore of the Aral Sea, which until the mid-80s still really looked like a sea. Basically, it was ordinary garrison life here, except perhaps for the not-so-comfortable climate, and the unprecedented secrecy measures, even by Soviet standards. Only a handful of people knew what the military was doing on this island. The rest could only guess, and keep silent. The island wasn't even marked on Soviet maps. The secrecy became even stricter in 1972, when the Soviet Union signed the Convention on the Complete Prohibition of Biological Weapons. The island's operations and security were provided by several military units stationed on its outskirts. There were air defense troops, aviation and radio aviation units, and a naval division stationed there. Military and civilian personnel for service on the island were selected with special care. Even the conscript soldiers had their backgrounds and references checked. According to the recollections of former soldiers, the entire island was divided into sectors. To enter each of them, a special permit was required. Planes arrived on the island every day, and often, when they were coming into land, the soldiers were confined to their barracks for several hours. Guards with automatic rifles were stationed along the runway, and they wouldn't let anyone near the planes, not even officers, without the proper clearance. Rumors circulated among the soldiers that these planes were bringing prisoners to the island for experiments. However, the soldiers didn't talk much among themselves about what was happening at the testing site. They were afraid of the special department. Military boats constantly patrolled around the island, and land patrols guarded it on shore. Civilian vessels were forbidden to come within 40 kilometers of the island. The laboratory building itself and the nearby testing ground were surrounded by 2 rows of barbed wire. A few dozen meters away, there were 2 more rows of barbed wire. There is a story about how Major General Korolyov, the head of the district's engineering troops, was not allowed onto the island when he wanted to see what was going on at the secret facility. And not only was he not allowed in, but the patrol boat aimed its machine guns at the general's vessel and, under threat of using weapons, forced him to leave. Experiments on the island. The testing range occupied the southern part of the island. Here, shells were detonated or substances were dispersed from an airplane. Pathogenic strains based on anthrax, plague, tularemia, Q fever, brucellosis, glanders, and other especially dangerous infections, as well as a large number of artificially created biological infections. They were tested on dogs, rabbits, guinea pigs, rats, horses, sheep, and monkeys. The latter were the most suitable because they were very similar to humans. Hundreds of monkeys were brought to the island directly from Africa. After the tests, the bodies of the animals were thoroughly examined, and then they were either cremated or buried in special animal burial pits. It was the monkeys that helped prove that the anthrax 836 strain of anthrax and specially bred weaponized plague bacteria could cause damage comparable to that of nuclear weapons. 100 kilograms of these pathogens would be enough to kill 3 million people in densely populated urban areas. All tests conducted on the island were always accompanied by anti-epidemic measures. After they were completed, the testing site was treated with disinfectant solutions. In addition, the high air temperature in the summer, reaching up to 45 degrees, allowed everything to be naturally sterilized within a few days. The level of bacteriological contamination of the soil was practically zero. It is quite likely that on Vozrozhdeniye Island, biological weapons tests were conducted not only on animals, but also on people. There are many recollections from former soldiers who served on the island about this. They talk about dozens and hundreds of prisoners who were brought to the testing site by planes. There is even information about female prisoners who were subjected to horrific experiments. The problem is that these stories can't be confirmed. The documents related to Vozrozhdeniye Island and the Soviet biological weapons program are mostly in Moscow and, of course, are still classified. Indirect evidence of human experiments was found in the laboratory building itself and in the nearby barracks. It seems that prisoners were indeed kept in these rooms. Moreover, judging by the well-preserved inscriptions and signs, some of the barracks were for women. Random victims. Despite all the precautions, the test site on Vozrozhdeniye Island regularly killed random people who had nothing to do with it. In 1971, the research vessel Levberg went off course and approached the island to within 15 kilometers. The ship was covered by a cloud of weaponized smallpox, as a result of which a female scientist fell ill. After returning to Uralsk, she infected 9 more people, 3 of whom died. In Moscow, they quickly realized what kind of strange epidemic had started in the Aral steppes and took emergency measures. A large city with 30,000 residents was literally isolated from the rest of the world. It was cordoned off by the military, who let no one in or out. Trains didn't stop passing by with their windows tightly shut, and the post office only accepted letters and parcels but didn't send anything anywhere. 50,000 people in the surrounding areas were vaccinated against smallpox. Thanks to the prompt and strict measures taken and the efforts of the country's best doctors and scientists who were sent to Aralsk, the spread of the infection was stopped. About a year after the events described, a drifting boat with the bodies of 2 fishermen was found near the island. The cause of their death was the plague. From time to time, local fishermen would pull entire nets of dead fish out of the sea. No one understood what was happening. Or rather, they had their suspicions, but they tried to keep them to themselves. In the spring of 1988, a huge herd of saigas suddenly died in the steppe near the island. Almost 50,000 animals died in almost an hour. They were likely covered by a cloud from the testing site. Leonid Besenko, who served at the testing site, recounted an incident he had witnessed firsthand. Not far from the island, local fishermen caught a fox, and 3 days later they died of pneumonic plague. The animal turned out to be infected. In 1988, the Americans obtained intelligence that, despite the signed Biological Weapons Convention, the USSR was producing the anthrax pathogen Anthrax S836. A scandal broke out, and the Soviets had to urgently cover their tracks. Between 100 and 200 tons of the pathogen were loaded into special containers and sent from Yekaterinburg, where the work was being done, to Vozrozhdeniye island. These extremely dangerous substances survived there. The rest were buried in 11 burial pits. Thanks to this story, the island became the largest biological weapons burial site in the world. The end of the test site. In the late 1960s, the Soviet leadership decided to turn the deserts around the Aral Sea into a blooming garden, redirecting water from the Amudarya and Sirdarya rivers to irrigate cotton fields. There really was more cotton, but this decision essentially killed the Aral Sea. Since these rivers were its main source of water, the sea began to dry up rapidly. By 1990, the area of Vozrozhdeniye Island had increased almost tenfold, and then it turned into a peninsula altogether. All this seriously complicated the operation of the testing site and greatly increased the cost of delivering supplies. However, work here continued right up until the collapse of the Union. It was only in 1992 that the facility was shut down. The military was relocated to Russia, and the most valuable equipment and documentation were taken away. Whatever couldn't be taken was simply left on the island. Deadly burial sites also remained here, and we can only guess what they contain. In the 1990s, American specialists visited the former test site. They studied the condition of the burial sites located here. It turned out that anthrax spores, that same deadly anthrax, had not died and posed a serious danger. A few words in conclusion. Aralsk today. It's a real ghost town, lost among a vast dead desert where even the sand itself is saturated with carcinogenic pesticides. A creepy and lifeless place, but the scariest thing is that this disaster is entirely man-made. After all, just 100 years ago, there was a lively fishing village here, surrounded by the turquoise lagoons of the Aral Sea. Now, only a few stalkers wander here. Yes, those looking to profit from scavenging, collecting metal, of which plenty remains at the former top-secret facility. Well, that's all I have for now. Goodbye, everyone.